The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the dusty square of Redemption Creek, baking the already parched earth and wilting the spirits of those who braved its midday glare. Alara, her belly swollen with the late stages of pregnancy, adjusted the thin cloth draped over her head, offering scant protection. Before her, laid out on a worn piece of canvas, were her hand-woven blankets. Each one was a testament to long nights and aching fingers, intricate patterns of desert flowers, mountain sunsets, and star-filled skies, their colors muted but rich, coaxed from native dyes she'd painstakingly prepared. Sails are slow today, almost non-existent, and a familiar knot of anxiety tightens in her chest. The small stack of coins in her pocket feels pitifully light against the weight of her needs. She shifts uncomfortably, the baby turning within her, a reminder of the precious life depending entirely on her dwindling strength and the few dollars these blankets might bring. Her gaze sweeps the sparse crowd, a flicker of hope dimming with each indifferent passerby. From the shaded boardwalk across the square, beneath the awning of the general store, a man watches. He's dressed like any other cowhand in dusty denim and worn leather, his hat pulled low, obscuring much of his face. No one in Redemption Creek would guess that Silas Blackwood could buy this entire town, and several more like it, without a second thought. But today, he is just a quiet observer, his attention fixed on the pregnant woman and her vibrant, unsold wares. There's a story in those threads, a resilience in her posture that belies the weariness in her eyes. There's more to this quiet woman and her vibrant blankets than meets the eye. Before her true worth or Silas's secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Alara's situation is precarious. Her solitude in this rough and tumble town, her visible vulnerability, makes her an easy target for assumptions, for the casual cruelty of strangers. Silas noted the way some folks glanced at her, then away, a mixture of pity and judgment in their eyes. He'd seen hardship, lived through his own share before fortune found him, but there was a quiet dignity about her that resonated deeper than mere sympathy. She wasn't begging, wasn't lamenting her fate to any who might listen. She was offering her craft, a piece of her soul woven into wool and cotton, asking only for a fair exchange. He watched her pack her unsold blankets as the sun began its descent, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and knew the dust of this town held more than just grit and despair. It held a silent strength, embodied by a woman fighting for two. The sun had dipped below the jagged peaks framing Redemption Creek when Alara finally folded her last blanket, the vibrant colors now subdued in the twilight. Her back ached, a dull, persistent throb that had become her constant companion. The few coins she'd earned clinked meagerly in her worn pouch, a stark reminder of the looming rent for her tiny room at Mrs. Gable's boarding house and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She had come to Redemption Creek weeks ago, a solitary figure stepping off the stagecoach with little more than a carpetbag and the rapidly growing secret beneath her shawl. Her husband, Thomas, a good man with a dreamer's heart, had perished in a flash flood that swept away their small homestead and all their hopes further north. Pregnant and alone, with Thomas's meager savings nearly gone, she'd heard whispers of work in the boomtowns, but Redemption Creek was as far as her money had taken her. Weaving was the only skill she possessed that might earn her keep, a craft taught by her grandmother, each knot and pattern a legacy of resilience. Silas Blackwood, known in the wider territories as the owner of the sprawling Blackwood Cattle Company and rumored to have lucrative mining interests, preferred anonymity when he could find it. In Redemption Creek, he was simply C, a man who paid his way, kept to himself, and occasionally bought supplies for a small, remote ranch he claimed to own up in the high country. A plausible fabrication that allowed him to observe the world without the distorting lens of his wealth. He'd come to Redemption Creek on a whim, escaping the endless demands of his empire, seeking a moment's peace. He found himself, instead, captivated by the quiet drama unfolding in the town square. He'd seen women in far worse straits, but Alara's stoic grace, the artistry in her hands, stirred something in him, a protective instinct he hadn't realized lay dormant. He'd built his fortune on shrewd decisions and a keen eye for value, and he saw a value in Alara that the townsfolk, in their haste and judgment, clearly missed. The town itself was a harsh mistress. Its rough-hewn buildings and dusty streets were populated by a mix of fortune-seekers, hardened settlers, and those simply trying to survive another day. Gossip was its currency, and a lone, pregnant woman was prime fodder. Alara felt the stares, heard the occasional hushed comment. Yesterday, as she'd been setting up her stall, Martha Perkins, the town's most formidable gossip, had sniffed loudly. "Some women have no shame, carrying on like that with no husband in sight. Ought to be run out. If you ask me," Alara had kept her gaze fixed on her blankets, her cheeks burning, but her hands steady. Silas, lingering near the smithy, had heard it too, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He'd made a mental note of Mrs. Perkins, filing her away with the other petty cruelties this town seemed to dole out so freely. Alara's rented room was small, stuffy, and offered little comfort. A narrow cot, a rickety table, and a single window that looked out onto a dusty alleyway were its only furnishings. But it was a roof over her head, a fragile barrier against the vast indifference of the world. Each evening, she would count her earnings, her heart sinking a little further. The baby was due in a matter of weeks, and the fear of what would happen then was a cold knot in her stomach. Silas, from his more comfortable lodgings at the town's only hotel, found his thoughts returning to her. He'd tried to dismiss her, tell himself her plight was none of his concern. But the image of her tired face, the quiet determination in her hands as she wove, kept intruding. He'd seen the raw, chapped skin of her knuckles, the slight tremor of exhaustion she tried to hide. He began to adjust his own routine, finding reasons to be near the square when she was there, observing from a distance, a silent, unseen guardian. He saw the subtle hunger in the way she sometimes looked at the fresh bread in the bakery window, the way she clutched her side when a particularly sharp pain shot through her. The stakes were impossibly high for her, and he, a man who could change her circumstances with a word, felt a growing, unfamiliar unease at his own inaction. The following market day began with a biting wind that whipped dust into Alara's eyes and threatened to send her blankets sailing across the square. She anchored them with stones, her fingers stiff with cold. Business was even slower than usual. People hurried past, heads down, eager to escape the chill. By noon, she hadn't made a single sale. Despair began to creep in, cold and insidious. She felt a wave of dizziness, her vision blurring for a moment. She leaned against the rough wooden post of a nearby awning, taking a deep breath, fighting back tears. That was when the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. Panic seized her. Her blankets, her only livelihood, would be ruined. She fumbled to gather them, her movements clumsy with haste and the bulk of her pregnancy. It was then that Silas moved. He'd been watching from the doorway of the mercantile, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Seeing her distress, the sudden storm, he didn't hesitate. He strode across the square, the rain already plastering his hat to his head. "Here, let me help you with those," he said, his voice calm and steady above the drumming of the rain. Alara looked up, startled, water dripping from her hair into her eyes. She saw a tall stranger, his face shadowed by his hat, but his presence strangely reassuring. Before she could protest, he was expertly gathering her precious wares, his large hands surprisingly gentle. "The mercantile owner won't mind if we shelter these inside for a bit," he said, already moving towards the store. Alara, clutching a few of the smaller pieces, hurried after him, a confusing mix of gratitude and suspicion churning within her. He helped her lay them out on a relatively dry section of the floor, away from the leaking roof. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what I would have done. Just common decency," Silas replied, though it felt like more than that to him. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the faint blue shadows beneath her eyes. "You look like you could use a warm drink. Mr. Henderson keeps a pot on the stove." He gestured towards the back of the store. She hesitated. Accepting help from a stranger was risky, but the offer of warmth was too tempting to refuse. "All right," she whispered. He procured 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected jolt through both of them. As they sipped the hot liquid, a semblance of normalcy returned. Silas, careful not to pry, asked a few general questions about her weaving, admiring the craftsmanship. "These are fine work," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a rare skill." Alara felt a flush of pride. "My grandmother taught me." "She taught you well," he paused. Then, as if an idea had just struck him, he said, "I have a ranch a bit out of town. Could use a few sturdy blankets like these. Perhaps I could purchase these from you?" "All of them." He named a price that was more than fair, enough to cover her rent for a month and leave some over for food. Alara stared at him, speechless. It was too generous, too sudden. "But why?" she stammered. "You haven't even looked at them all properly." "I've seen enough to know quality," Silas said, his gaze steady. "And frankly, ma'am, it looks like you could use the sale more than I need to haggle." His directness disarmed her. The offer was a lifeline, pride warred with desperate need. I accept," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." "I think I might have an idea," he said softly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. He paid her in crisp bills, a sum that felt like a fortune in her calloused palm. As the rain began to subside, he helped her repack the blankets, now his. "I'll arrange to have these collected later," he told her. When he left, Alara sank onto a wooden crate, the money clutched in her hand, tears finally streaming down her face, tears of relief, of gratitude, and a bewildering sense of hope. Silas Blackwood, meanwhile, walked back to his hotel, the rain-soaked shoulders of his coat a minor discomfort compared to the unsettling warmth spreading through his chest. He told himself it was just a business transaction, a way to alleviate her immediate suffering. But he knew, with a certainty that both pleased and troubled him, that it was much more than that. He had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so had irrevocably tied his path to hers. The immediate relief Alara felt from Silas's unexpected purchase was immense. She paid her overdue rent to a surprised Mrs. Gable, bought a loaf of fresh bread, cheese, and a small piece of salted pork, luxuries she hadn't dared dream of just hours before. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, the fear of imminent destitution momentarily held at bay. Silas, true to his word, had sent a young man from the livery to collect the blankets the next morning. Alara watched them go, a pang of something akin to loss mingling with her gratitude. Those blankets were a part of her, tangible pieces of her history and her hopes. Silas, however, had no intention of letting their interaction end there. He found himself drawn to the square again the following day, half expecting, half hoping to see her. He told himself he was merely curious, ensuring his act of charity hadn't been misplaced. When he saw her, not at her usual spot with wares to sell, but sitting quietly on a bench, mending a tear in her shawl, he felt a strange pull. He approached her, his hat in his hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Mind if I join you?" Alara looked up, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Mr. C, wasn't it?" "Just C is fine," he confirmed. taking a seat a respectful distance away. "I trust you're doing a little better today." "Much better, thanks to you," she said earnestly. "I still can't quite believe it. You were an answer to a prayer." He shifted uncomfortably, and used to such heartfelt gratitude. "Like I said, good craftsmanship deserves a fair price." He paused, then ventured, "Those patterns, they're very intricate. Takes a lot of patience, I imagine." "It does," she agreed. "But it's peaceful work. It helps me think." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the ebb and flow of town life. Silas found himself noticing small details about her, the way a stray strand of auburn hair escaped her braid, the gentle curve of her lips when she smiled faintly at a child chasing a dog, the quiet strength in her hands as they moved deftly with the needle. He learned, through casual conversation over the next few days, a little more about her. She spoke of her grandmother with affection, of the herbs and berries used for dyes, of the rhythm of the loom. She never complained about her situation, never spoke of her late husband, but Silas sensed a deep well of grief carefully contained. He, in turn, offered little about himself, sticking to his vague story of a small ranch. He spoke of cattle, of the changing seasons, of the solitude of the high country, truths, but not the whole truth. Alara, accustomed to the harsh realities of life, didn't press. She found his quiet presence comforting, his respectfulness a balm to her weary soul. He never overstepped, never presumed. He would often buy her a cup of coffee if it was chilly, or share a piece of fruit he'd bought from the mercantile. Small gestures that meant the world to her. The town, however, began to notice. Martha Perkins and her cronies were often seen whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between Alara and Silas. "See that, see," spending time with her, Mrs. Perkins was overheard saying at the dressmaker's shop. "A man like that, with a decent spread to his name, ought to have better sense. She's likely just after his money. What little he has," the irony of the statement, given Silas's true wealth, was lost on them. Silas was aware of the gossip. It irked him, but he refused to let it dictate his actions. He was, however, careful to ensure their interactions remained public and proper, to give no fuel to malicious tongues beyond what they were already inventing. Yet, the protectiveness he felt towards Alara grew. He saw the way she sometimes flinched when a rough-looking man passed too close, the way her hand instinctively went to her belly. One afternoon, as Alara was walking back to Mrs. Gable's, a group of rowdy drovers, fresh off the trail and flush with pay, blocked her path. Their leader, a burly man with a leering grin, stepped forward. "Well now, what have we here? A pretty little flower, all alone." Alara tried to step around him, her heart pounding. "Excuse me, please." "Not so fast, sweetheart," he said, reaching for her arm. Before he could touch her, a hand shot out, gripping his wrist like a vice. Silas stood there, his eyes cold as a mountain stream. "I believe the lady asked you to excuse her," he said, his voice dangerously low. The drover, surprised by Silas's sudden appearance and the strength in his grip, tried to pull away. "This ain't none of your business, mister." "I'm making it my business," Silas said, his grip tightening. The man winced. "Now, apologize to the lady and be on your way." The other drovers shifted nervously, sensing Silas was not a man to be trifled with. Their leader, after a moment of glaring, mumbled an apology and backed away, his bravado deflated. Silas watched them go, then turned to Alara. "Are you all right?" She was trembling but nodded. "Yes, thank you, see." Again. "No need for thanks," he said gruffly, though his concern was evident. "Some men just don't know how to behave." He walked her to Mrs. Gable's door, a silent guardian. The incident, while unsettling, forged a new layer in their burgeoning connection. Alara saw a strength in him that went beyond mere physical presence. It was a moral strength, a willingness to stand up for what was right. And Silas, having acted to protect her, felt his casual interest solidifying into something deeper, something that felt perilously close to commitment. The rhythm of their days settled into a quiet pattern. Silas would often find Alara in the square, perhaps not every day, but often enough. Sometimes he would simply nod a greeting. Other times, he'd sit with her for a while, sharing news he'd gleaned from the mercantile or offering a piece of advice about which vendor had the freshest vegetables. He commissioned another blanket from her, a specific design he described a simple geometric pattern in earthy tones. "For my cabin," he explained. "Gets cold up there," it gave her purpose, a reason to set up her small loom in her room, the familiar click-clack a soothing sound in the quiet evenings. It also provided her with a steady, if modest, income. He learned to read her moods, the subtle signs of her fatigue or discomfort. On days when she seemed particularly weary, he'd make an excuse to buy her a nourishing meal from the eatery, claiming he was tired of his own cooking or had ordered too much. She'd protest, but he was gently insistent, and she'd eventually relent, grateful for the sustenance and the unspoken care. She, in turn, began to notice things about him, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, despite his current leisurely appearance in town. She saw the loneliness in him too, a mirrored reflection of her own. One cool evening, as the sun cast long shadows, they sat on the bench, sharing a small bag of roasted pecans Silas had bought. "The baby will be here soon," Alara said softly, her hand resting on her swollen abdomen. Sometimes I'm afraid." It was the first time she'd voiced her fear so openly to him. Silas looked at her, his expression serious. "It's natural to be afraid," he said quietly. "But you're strong, Alara. Stronger than you think." He hesitated, then added, "You won't be alone." The words hung in the air, simple but profound. Alara looked at him, searching his face. She saw no pity, only a quiet sincerity that warmed her to the core. A fragile tendril of trust, which had been slowly unfurling within her, took deeper root. She didn't know much about this man, but she knew he was kind, and in her world, kindness was a rare and precious commodity. The deepening connection between Alara and Silas did not go unnoticed, and it began to attract a more pointed, unwelcome kind of attention. Jedediah Croft, the self-important town councilman and owner of the largest saloon, had taken a dislike to Silas from the moment he'd first seen him calmly diffusing the situation with the drovers. Croft, a man who thrived on perceived power and the intimidation of others, saw Silas's quiet confidence as a challenge. He also had a lecherous eye that had, on more than one occasion, lingered unpleasantly on Alara. One afternoon, as Silas was leaving the general store, Croft accosted him on the boardwalk. "Blackwood, ain't it? Or is it just see you go by these days?" Croft's tone was laden with insinuation. News of Silas's true surname, if not his full status, had clearly begun to circulate, perhaps carried by a traveling merchant or a newly arrived gambler who recognized him from a more cosmopolitan setting.
Silas met Crofts Kees Cooley.
"Silas Blackwood is my name. Most folks find C easier." "Heard you own a fair bit of land," Croft pressed, his eyes narrowed. "Surprised to see a man like you taking such an interest in local charity cases." He jerked his head subtly in the direction of the square, where Alara was sitting. Silas's jaw tightened. "My interests are my own concern, Croft, and I'd advise you to choose your words more carefully when speaking of Mrs. Alara. She's a lady deserving of respect." Croft smirked. "A lady, is she? Looks more like a woman in trouble, looking for a man to solve her problems. And you, Blackwood, look like you're eager to be that man." The thinly veiled insult towards Alara ignited a cold anger in Silas. "She earns an honest living with her skill, which is more than can be said for some who profit from the weaknesses of others," Silas retorted, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "If you have something to say." The encounter was a stark reminder that his anonymity was fading, and with it, the simple peace he'd hoped to find. More importantly, it signaled a rising threat to Alara. Croft was not a man to let a perceived slight go unanswered. He found Alara later, her face pale. She'd seen the confrontation from a distance, if not heard the words. "Is everything all right, see?" she asked, her voice anxious. "Just a misunderstanding with Mr. Croft," Silas said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Nothing for you to worry about," but he knew, and she sensed, that it was more than that. A shadow had fallen over their quiet sanctuary. That evening, Alara felt a renewed wave of anxiety. Silas's presence had become a shield. But what if that shield drew even more unwelcome attention? What if his kindness towards her brought him trouble? The thought was unbearable. The next few days were fraught with a subtle tension. Croft made a point of staring pointedly at Alara whenever she was in the square, his gaze oily and possessive. Townsfolk, sensing a shift in the local power dynamic, grew more cautious in their interactions with both Alara and Silas. Some, who had perhaps offered a friendly nod before, now hurried past. The blanket Silas had commissioned was nearly finished, and Alara worked on it with a sense of urgency, as if its completion might somehow ward off the encroaching trouble. One evening, as Silas walked Alara back to Mrs. Gable's, he spoke, his voice serious. "Alara, I think it might be best if you weren't so visible in the square for a while. Croft is a man who enjoys making trouble." Her heart sank. "Are you saying I should hide?" "No," he said gently. "I'm saying you should be careful. Your well-being and that of the baby is what matters most." He paused, then continued. "I have a small cabin, the one I mentioned, up in the foothills. It's quiet, secluded. You'd be safe there until things settle down. Or until the baby comes." Alara stared at him, taken aback by the offer. Leave town? Go with him to his cabin? It was a drastic step. "But, your cabin? I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," Silas insisted. "It's simple, but it's secure. And I'd be nearby, at the main ranch house. It's not far from there." This was a slight modification of his earlier, simpler tale of a lone cabin, a necessary adjustment to accommodate her presence. "Think about it, Alara. Please." The fear of Croft, combined with the looming birth and her dwindling resources, despite Silas's commissions, made his offer sound like a sanctuary. But it also meant placing her complete trust in him, a man she still knew relatively little about, despite the kindness he'd shown. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deceit, any hidden motive. She saw only genuine concern. I'll think about it," she whispered. The decision was made for her sooner than she expected. The very next afternoon, as Alara was returning from a short walk to ease her aching back, she found Mrs. Gable waiting for her on the porch, her face a mask of distress. "Alara, dear, Mr. Croft was just here," she said, wringing her hands. He said there have been complaints about your situation. He said if you weren't gone from my boarding house by tomorrow morning, he'd have the sheriff declare it a place of ill repute and shut me down." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Croft was making his move, using his influence to hound her out of town, to isolate her. Mrs. Gable, though sympathetic, was clearly terrified of losing her livelihood. "I understand, Mrs. Gable," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll find somewhere else." "But where?" The question echoed in the sudden, crushing silence. She had nowhere to go. The weight of her helplessness, the vulnerability of her unborn child, pressed down on her. It was in this moment of despair that Silas found her, having come by to see if she'd made a decision about his cabin. The sight of her pale, stricken face told him something was terribly wrong. When Mrs. Gable tearfully relayed Croft's ultimatum, Silas's expression hardened into granite. The pretense was over. Croft had crossed a line, and in doing so had forced Silas's hand. He turned to Alara, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not finding somewhere else, Alara. You're coming with me. Now. There was no more room for hesitation. The threat was real, immediate. Alara nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. This wasn't just an offer of shelter anymore. It was a rescue. Silas arranged for a buckboard swiftly and efficiently. Alara packed her few belongings, her loom, her clothes, the nearly finished blanket, and the small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. Within the hour, under the curious and sometimes scornful gaze of Redemption Creek's inhabitants, Alara, visibly pregnant and her face etched with a mixture of fear and fragile hope, was helped onto the buckboard by Silas Blackwood. As they rode out of town, leaving the dusty streets and judgmental eyes behind, Alara didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed on the broad, determined set of Silas's shoulders, a silent testament to the unexpected protector who had stepped out of the shadows and into the very center of her collapsing world. The journey to Silas's property was made mostly in silence, the rhythmic creak of the buckboard wheels and the soft thud of hooves the only sounds accompanying their thoughts. Alara was still reeling from the swiftness of events, from Croft's cruelty and Silas's decisive intervention. She stole glances at Silas, his profile resolute as he guided the horses along the rough track leading away from Redemption Creek and into the rolling foothills. The air grew cooler, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as they climbed. After a couple of hours, Silas turned the horses onto a less traveled path, almost hidden by overgrown brush. It opened into a small, secluded valley, nestled amongst a grove of cottonwoods. Beside a clear, babbling creek was a cabin. It was small, sturdily built of timber and stone, with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It looked peaceful, safe. "This is it," Silas said, pulling the horses to a halt. "The guest cabin. My main ranch house is about a mile further up the valley." He helped her down, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment, a steadying pressure. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's warm and dry." Inside, it was simple but immaculately clean. A comfortable-looking bed was made up with thick quilts. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a small table and chairs sat near a window that looked out onto the creek. There were even a few books on a rough-hewn shelf. It was a haven compared to her cramped room at Mrs. Gable's. It's wonderful, see," Alara breathed, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "Thank you. I'll bring your things in," he said, turning back to the buckboard. He made several trips, carrying her loom, her bag, and a box of supplies he'd apparently already stocked: flour, coffee, dried beans, smoked bacon. He showed her the woodpile, the well, how to work the stove. His practicality was reassuring. "I'll send word with one of my men to check on you daily," he told her before he left to see to the horses. "And I'll be back this evening to make sure you're settled." Left alone, Alara slowly explored her new, temporary home. She ran her hand over the smooth, worn wood of the table, looked out at the tranquil scene beyond the window. The fear that had gripped her in town began to recede, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude, and something else, a burgeoning, tender feeling for the quiet, unexpected man who had offered her this sanctuary. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Silas Blackwood was more than just a kind rancher. There was a depth to him, a capability that hinted at a life beyond the simple persona he presented. But whatever his secrets, his actions spoke of a profound decency. Later that evening, as promised, Silas returned. He brought a stew he'd made at the main house, rich with vegetables and meat. They ate together at the small table, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was comfortable, almost domestic. "Croft won't bother you here," Silas said, breaking the silence. "This is my land. He has no jurisdiction, no power here." "But what about you?" Alara asked, her brow furrowed with worry. "Will he try to make trouble for you in town because of me?" Silas met her gaze, his own serious. Croft is a bully, Alara. Bullies only have power if you let them. And I don't intend to let him. Besides, he added, a wry smile touching his lips, I have a feeling Mr. Croft is about to find he has other, more pressing business to attend to than harassing pregnant women. He didn't elaborate, but Alara sensed a steely determination beneath his calm demeanor. Over the next few days, a new routine established itself. One of Silas's ranch hands, a quiet, respectful young man named Ben, would stop by each morning with fresh milk and any supplies Alara needed. Silas himself would visit in the evenings, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just to sit by the fire and talk. He told her stories of the ranch, of difficult winters and calving season, of the beauty of the high country. He spoke of his parents, long gone, who had homesteaded this land with nothing but grit and determination. He still kept his vast wealth and the true extent of his holdings a secret, not out of deceit, but because here, in this quiet valley, with this woman, he wanted to be just the man, not Silas Blackwood, the magnate. Alara, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She spoke of Thomas, of their dreams, of the terrible flood that had taken him. She talked about her grandmother, the strong, wise woman who had taught her not only to weave but also to endure. She showed him the blanket she was finishing for him, the intricate pattern nearly complete. He admired it genuinely, tracing the lines with his finger. You have a true gift, Alara, he said, his voice filled with an admiration that made her blush. The peace of the valley was a healing balm. Alara's health improved. The color returned to her cheeks. The shadows beneath her eyes faded. She spent her days weaving, walking by the creek, or simply sitting on the cabin porch, watching the play of light and shadow on the mountains. The baby moved within her, strong and active, a constant reminder of the new life to come. Her fear lessened, replaced by a quiet anticipation, and a growing affection for the man who had made this possible. Silas found himself looking forward to his evening visits more than he cared to admit. Alara's quiet strength, her resilience, her gentle nature, they were like a soothing balm to his own often cynical soul. He'd spent so many years building his empire, surrounded by people who wanted something from him, who saw him only for his wealth. Alara saw him, the man who brought her stew and talked by the fire, and he found that he liked the man she saw. One evening, as a chill wind whistled around the eaves of the cabin, Alara shivered despite the fire. Silas, noticing, stood up and retrieved the nearly finished blanket from her loom. May I? He asked. She nodded. He gently draped it around her shoulders. It was warm, heavy, smelling faintly of wool and the herbs she used in her dyes. It's beautiful, she whispered, her fingers stroking the soft texture. You're beautiful, Silas said, his voice husky. He hadn't meant to say it, the words slipping out, unbidden. Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide, luminous in the firelight. The air in the small cabin suddenly felt charged, thick with unspoken emotions. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on hers. He could see the pulse beating in her throat, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. He wanted to kiss her, more than he'd wanted anything in a long time. But then, he saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, the faint shadow of her past grief, and he hesitated. He wouldn't rush her, wouldn't take advantage of her dependence on him. He stepped back, a muscle working in his jaw. You should get some rest, he said softly. It's late. Alara nodded, a mixture of disappointment and relief washing over her. She wasn't sure she was ready for what she'd seen in his eyes, yet a part of her yearned for it. Good night, she said. Good night, Alara. He left then, striding out into the cold night, his mind in turmoil. He was falling in love with her. The realization was as undeniable as the mountains surrounding them, and just as daunting. This was no longer about simple kindness or protection. This was about his heart, a heart he'd guarded for so long, now irrevocably entangled with the fate of the pregnant woman in the cabin. The quiet rhythm of life in the valley was shattered a week later. Alara had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable, with Braxton Hicks' contractions coming more frequently. Silas, noticing her heightened restlessness during his evening visits, had grown more watchful. He'd instructed Ben to check on her twice a day. It was mid-morning when the real labor pains began, sharp and insistent. Alara tried to breathe through them, remembering her grandmother's advice, but a wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone. Ben wasn't due for another few hours. She managed to make her way to the door, hoping to see him, but the path was empty. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she cried out, clutching the doorframe for support. As if summoned by her distress, Silas appeared, riding hard down the valley path. He'd had a premonition, a sudden, inexplicable urge to check on her himself. The sight of her, pale and clearly in pain, confirmed his worst fears. He was off his horse in an instant, rushing to her side. "Alara, what is it?" "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." Silas's mind raced. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Creek, hours away by buckboard too far. There was an old midwife, Martha Yellowfeather, who lived in a small settlement further up in the mountains, but even that would take time. He had to act now. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, masking his own surge of adrenaline. "Let's get you inside. Back to bed." He half-carried her to the bed, his strength a comfort. He remembered snippets of conversations from his ranch hands, tales of births in remote locations, things his own mother had told him. He knew the basics: hot water, clean cloths. He set a large pot of water to boil on the stove, his movements efficient and purposeful. He found clean linens where Alara had stored them. "Ben is on his way to fetch Martha Yellowfeather," he told Alara, a necessary lie to calm her. He'd actually sent Ben riding like the wind to Redemption Creek, not for the doctor, but with an urgent, coded message for his lawyer, who was discreetly staying at the hotel there, handling the Croft situation. Silas knew with grim certainty that Croft would not take his defeat lying down, and the birth of this child on Blackwood land might give the councilman new ammunition if he chose to be malicious. For the next few hours, Silas became Alara's lifeline. He coached her through contractions, wiped her brow, spoke words of encouragement, his voice a steady anchor in her sea of pain. He was surprisingly adept, his large hands gentle as he supported her. In the crucible of childbirth, all pretense fell away. There was only Alara, struggling to bring her child into the world, and Silas, a steadfast presence by her side, sharing her ordeal. She clung to his hand, her knuckles white, her body racked with effort. She cried out, and he murmured soothing words, his face close to hers. He saw her courage, her incredible strength, and his admiration for her deepened into something akin to reverence. He was no longer just protecting her. He was bound to her by the intensity of this shared experience. Finally, with a last, desperate cry, the baby arrived, a healthy, squalling boy, his tiny fists waving in the air. Silas, his hands surprisingly steady, cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a soft, clean cloth Alara had prepared. He laid the baby on Alara's breast. Tears streamed down Alara's face as she looked at her son, her beautiful, perfect son. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, touching the baby's soft cheek. "Our son." Silas watched them, his own eyes suspiciously moist. A wave of profound tenderness washed over him. He had helped bring this new life into the world, and in doing so, felt as if he, too, had been reborn. He carefully tended to Alara, making her comfortable, ensuring she had water. The cabin was filled with a sense of peace, of quiet triumph. The storm had passed. Later, as Alara slept, exhausted but serene, the baby nestled beside her. Silas sat by the fire, watching over them. He felt a fierce protectiveness, a love so profound it ached in his chest. This woman, this child, they were his family now. He knew it with absolute certainty. He would move heaven and earth to keep them safe, to give them the life they deserved. His thoughts turned to Croft. Ben should have reached Redemption Creek by now. Silas's instructions to his lawyer, a formidable man named Elijah Thorne, had been precise. Thorne was to make it abundantly clear to Croft and any other relevant town officials that Alara and her child were under the personal protection of Silas Blackwood. Any further harassment or attempts to slander her name would be met with the full force of Blackwood's considerable legal and financial power. It was a veiled threat, but one Silas knew Croft, for all his bluster, would understand. Silas Blackwood was not a man to cross lightly, especially when it came to those he cared for. His anonymity in Redemption Creek was well and truly gone, but it was a small price to pay. The first rays of dawn were painting the sky when Alara awoke. She felt sore, exhausted, but an incredible sense of peace enveloped her. She looked at her son, sleeping soundly beside her, his tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. Then she saw Silas, asleep in the chair by the dying fire, his head slumped forward, his face etched with fatigue but softened in repose. He looked vulnerable yet incredibly strong. He stirred as she shifted, his eyes opening instantly. He was by her side in a moment. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Tired," she admitted. "But happy. So happy," she smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thank you, C, for everything. We wouldn't have made it without you." "Nonsense," he said gruffly, though his heart swelled at her words. "You did all the hard work." He looked at the baby. "He's a fine boy, strong, like his mother." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Alara knew, without him saying a word, that something profound had shifted between them during the long hours of the night. The barriers were down. Later that day, Martha Yellowfeather arrived, a weathered, wise-looking Apache woman with kind eyes. Ben, having delivered his message, had indeed been dispatched to fetch her as a precaution, though Silas's capable hands had already done what was most needed. Martha examined Alara and the baby, nodding approvingly. "You did well, both of you," she said, her gaze lingering on Silas with a knowing look. "This child is strong. He has a good spirit." She stayed for a few days, helping Alara with the baby, sharing her knowledge of herbs and remedies, her calm presence a further comfort. During those days, Silas was a constant, steady presence. He took care of the chores, cooked meals, ensured Alara had everything she needed. He held the baby, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, a look of wonder on his face. Alara watched him, her heart overflowing. This man, who had come into her life as a stranger, had become her rock, her protector, her dearest friend. And, she realized with a jolt that was both terrifying and exhilarating, she was falling in love with him. The news from Redemption Creek, when it finally arrived via Ben, was satisfactory. Elijah Thorne had, as expected, handled Mr. Croft with surgical precision. Apparently, a quiet conversation about certain discrepancies in the saloon's liquor licenses and some outstanding gambling debts owed to rather influential parties with whom Thorne had connections, had significantly dampened Croft's enthusiasm for public crusades. The town council, suddenly aware that Silas Blackwood was not just a small-time rancher but a man of considerable means and influence, had quickly lost interest in Alara's affairs. Redemption Creek, it seemed, had decided to mind its own business. One evening, after Martha Yellowfeather had departed and the baby was asleep in his cradle, a beautifully crafted piece Silas had produced from somewhere on the main ranch, Alara and Silas sat by the fire, the blanket he'd commissioned now draped over the back of her chair. "He needs a name," Alara said softly. "I've been thinking." "Thomas, of course, for his father," But he needs his own name too. Silas looked at her, then at the sleeping child. What about Ethan? He suggested quietly. It means strong, enduring. Alara considered it. Thomas Ethan. Ethan Thomas. Ethan, she repeated. Yes, I like that. Thomas Ethan. Ethan Blackwood. The question hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Silas's breath caught. He turned to her, his heart pounding. He saw the hope in her eyes, the quiet courage it took for her to even suggest it. He reached out, taking her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. Alara, he began, his voice thick with emotion. There's so much I haven't told you. About me. About my life. I know you're not just a simple rancher, see? She interrupted gently. I've known for a while. It doesn't matter. What matters is the man you are. The man who saved me, who delivered my son, who has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze searching hers. Alara, I love you. I think I've loved you since I first saw you in that dusty square. So proud and strong despite everything. I want to build a life with you, with Ethan. If you'll have me. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but these were tears of joy. Oh, see, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, yes, I'll have you. He lowered his head and kissed her then, a kiss that was tender and passionate, a kiss that sealed their unspoken promises, a kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of unexpected love, and of a future filled with hope. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and tears and the enduring strength of the human heart. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, now felt like the true beginning of their home. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet joy. Alara regained her strength. Her days now centered around the rhythms of baby Ethan and the growing warmth of her relationship with Silas. He formally asked her to marry him, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple, heartfelt proposal by the creek one sunny afternoon, presenting her with a delicate gold band he'd had Thorne procure, his mother's wedding ring. They were married by a traveling preacher a month later, a small, private ceremony at the main ranch house, a sprawling, comfortable home that Silas had, until Alara, found too large and too empty. Ben was there, beaming, along with a few trusted ranch hands and their wives who had come to welcome Alara and Ethan into the Blackwood fold. Martha Yellowfeather also attended, her presence a blessing. Alara, holding Ethan, stood beside Silas, her hand in his, no longer the destitute woman selling blankets in the square, but a cherished wife and mother, her inner strength now matched by an outer serenity. Silas looked at her, his heart full. He had sought solitude and anonymity in Redemption Creek, and instead had found his purpose, his family, his love. The world outside their valley mattered little in those early days. The whispers from Redemption Creek eventually faded, replaced by grudging respect when news of Silas Blackwood's true standing and his marriage became undeniable. Some, like Mrs. Gable, even sent small gifts for the baby, perhaps out of genuine goodwill, or perhaps out of a desire to be on the right side of the valley's most powerful resident. Croft remained conspicuously silent, his ambitions curtailed. One crisp autumn evening, Silas and Alara sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, baby Ethan asleep in his cradle beside them. One of Alara's earliest blankets, the one with the desert flowers, was draped over the back of Silas's chair. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Are you happy, Alara?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her gaze on the peaceful valley spread before them. "More than I ever thought possible," she whispered. The journey had been fraught with hardship, with fear and uncertainty, but it had led her here, to this man, this child, this life. He smoothed a stray curl from her forehead as she looked down at their sleeping son, her son, now their son. Silas knew his carefully guarded world had finally found its center, woven from courage, resilience, and a love as unexpected and sturdy as the threads of her blankets. The billionaire cowboy had found his greatest treasure, not in gold or land, but in the quiet strength of a woman's heart and the promise of a shared future. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.